The three choices for calculation method in Gradebook are assignment points, assignment weighting, and category weighting. Now, they may seem interchangeable, but these calculation methods can actually produce different overall grades. I'll go over this in more detail in the following slides, but just as a quick example, let's say you have a student who earned the following scores. On the midterm, he got 50 out of 100, then scored quite a bit better on the final with 180 out of 200 points. On the quizzes, he earned 17 out of 20 on the first one, and 73 out of 80 on the second quiz. So in summary, the student scored a total of 320 points out of 400 possible points for the class. Now, depending on the grade calculation method you choose, these would be his grades. As you can see, there's quite a bit of difference. Category weighting gives him the highest score with an 82%, which counts as a B in traditional grading categories. Assignment weighting gave him the lowest at 77.25%, which would give him a C. And assignment points is right in the middle with 80%, barely a B. Let's break it down and see how we got each of those numbers. Also, it's a good idea to keep in mind that there are pros and cons to each of these methods. Assignment points is the easiest and most straightforward of the calculation methods. A point is a point, whether the student earns those points on a test or an extra credit assignment. So, in the example we saw before, our student earned 320 points. This was out of a possible 400 points for the class. This calculation method uses just straight algebra. 320 divided by 400 gives us 0.80 or 80%. In assignment weighting, you give a percentage weight to each individual entry you'd put into your gradebook. For example, Unit 6 homework assignment, Chapter 2 vocab quiz, the Great Gatsby symbolism essay. Each of those assignments, quote unquote, is worth a certain percentage of the grade. In our example class, the midterm and final were both worth 30% each, and each quiz was worth 20% for a total of 100%. If we look back at our sample student, we can see that his final exam was graded out of 200 points and the midterm out of 100. Now, in the first grading calculation method we looked at, assignment points, the final counted twice as much as the midterm because it was 200 points. But in this example, using assignment weighting, both the midterm and the final are worth the same amount. So even though the final is scored out of 200 points, it's still worth 30% of the grade. Here's how we'd calculate the student's grade using assignment weighting. With each assignment, or entry, that goes into the gradebook, the student has the potential to earn up to a certain percentage of the pie, as it were. With the midterm, for example, he could have earned up to 30% of the pie, but he scored only 50 out of 100 points, so he only earned half of what he could have. It's the same for each assignment. When you add up the parts of the pie he did manage to earn, the student got a 77.25% in the class. This isn't to say that students are always going to earn lower grades if you use assignment weighting in your class. It's just to demonstrate that different methods of grading can end up giving the same student different final grades. One of the great things about Gradebook is that if you use assignment weighting, you can still add some extra assignments you weren't planning on or even take some away. If the percentage weights of all your assignments add up to something other than 100% at the end, the system automatically calculates a relative weight for each one so that the relative weights themselves total 100%. This allows for quite a bit of flexibility throughout the semester. Category weighting is similar to assignment weighting, except now you group the individual entries together into categories, and those different categories are worth a certain percentage of the pie. In our sample class, the midterm and final are grouped together in the test category, which is worth 60%, and the two quizzes together make up the quiz category, which is worth 40% of the grade. Here's where things can get a bit tricky. When you want to calculate the student's grade using category weighting as your overall calculation method, you then have to choose a calculation method for figuring out the percentage grade within each category. Your two choices are using points, i.e. assignment points, or percentages, i.e. assignment weighting. In the next slide, we're going to calculate the student's grade using category weighting as the overall calculation method and points for figuring out what the student earned within each category. Again, here we're using category weighting as the overall calculation method and points as the method to figure out the student's category percentages. Here, all his earned test points are added together and divided by the total number of possible points in all tests. That number is then multiplied by the percentage value for that category. For this test category, it's worth 60% of the pie. The same formula applies for the quiz category, which makes up 40% of the pie. When you add up the various percentages our student earned in each category, he receives an 82% in the class. Choosing between the three overall calculation methods can seem a bit like choosing between apples and oranges, or in this case, apples and pears. So it might be helpful to think about some pros and cons of the different methods. One of the advantages of the point system is that it's very straightforward and familiar to most students. One disadvantage is that during the semester, you might wind up giving more homework or fewer tests than you'd planned. Then, the students' grades would be more heavily influenced by their homework scores than you'd wanted them to be. In a category weighting system, this couldn't occur. If you decided that homework was going to be worth 15% of your student's grade, and then you wound up giving a few more homework assignments throughout the term, homework would still be worth 15% of the grade, and it'd stay 15% no matter how much you assigned. But on the other hand, one of the cons of this method is that it's harder to explain to students. So again, apples and oranges, or pears. Whichever method you wind up choosing, Gradebook makes it easy to calculate and keep track of your students' scores. In the next videos, I'll show you how to set up Gradebook for each of the different calculation methods.